You're listening to Culture 360, the podcast that takes you inside the world of workplace and team culture. I'm Stu Savage, your host and guide, as we explore the ideas, people, and stories shaping the way we work, lead, and connect. So please subscribe, sit back, relax, and enjoy culture from every angle. Hello and welcome to the Culture 360 podcast in association with the Culture Room. I'm Stu Savage, your host and guide. And today I'm with an old peer and colleague and friend of mine, Dr. Andy Martin at Massey University. Welcome to the podcast, Andy. I think our paths first crossed in 2009 and you used to send some of your undergraduate students from the School of Sport and Exercise and Nutrition at Massey University to us at Sportman Hour 2 as part of the practicum. And I think it was probably a couple of months they came along to us. And I do remember one or two students coming along and working with them. I think at the time my role was regional advisor in coaching and club development. And they used to come and obviously learn the ropes and go off to be captains of industry. So thank you for being part of the podcast today. It's really appreciate your time and your knowledge. I think firstly, if you could just probably give a little bit of background and context to yourself and your professional and personal life and around sport, that would be really useful for the listener.
Well, like you, Stu, I come from England originally, where I was started off as a school teacher, did a bit of coaching, interested in football as yourself, and ended up in New Zealand in the early 90s managing events, and then here at Massey for quite a long time now. So yeah, the teaching side, coaching side, and I guess I certainly call myself more of a coach these days, and mainly involved in aspects of sport management, so teaching event management, teaching sport coaching, and as you mentioned, supervising the practicums or internships where our students hopefully go out there and add value to an organisation and then go on to, as you say, be leaders in industry. So, it's been an interesting and challenging career, but one that I've loved.
Awesome. I think we really connected probably in recent years just around organisational culture and leadership, which has been really a focus for both of us. Certainly with me, with part of this business of the Culture Room and the podcast and the blog Culture 360. And it's been a real eye-opener for me doing some research and reading those books that you've co-authored. So there was obviously Legends in Black around the All Blacks and The Will to Win around the Silver Ferns, which are two iconic brands here in New Zealand. If you could give us a cinematic trailer version of these books, like what could people expect that people that haven't read these books, these texts, what could they expect from it if you were going to give us a snapshot and why would they pick them up? And how is it relevant to them in their organisations and teams?
Well, I think starting with the All Blacks first, the All Blacks is one of the most, if not the most successful sporting teams in the world. They're, highest winning record of most national teams. So I guess we were interested in why they won and particularly why they kept on winning and why they continue to win. They don't win all the time, but there's a big focus on winning. And with the Silver Ferns, they don't win quite as much. Obviously, the Australians tend to beat New Zealand a little bit more, but they do win sometimes. And we were interested in why there were phases where the Silver Ferns did win. And I guess alongside that, as a good academic, we're looking at academic models, if you like, and we're certainly drawn to a professor in the US in Boston, Edgar Schein, who's written a number of books around organisational culture and leadership. And he had a model, I guess, an iceberg model of what's called artifacts. So these visual representations of culture that are above the surface, but also below the surface, the values and the core assumptions that are really important for a team. So I guess the other key thing within the All Blacks and Silver Ferns books are we interviewed captains and coaches. So we wanted to know about the leaders, about what the leaders thought and how they, if you like, drove the culture and the various aspects of that. And with the Silver Ferns and the All Blacks, they've been successful over time. So we also wanted to see that sort of change over time. So we looked at a 60-year period. So for the All Blacks, that was the amateur era, moving through to the sort of shamateur era, and then over the last 20 years or so, the professional era. And the Silver Ferns have followed similar I guess, pathway, maybe not quite so professional in terms of getting paid what the All Blacks get. Again, those transitions over time, and what were the key factors that drove those successes?
So if I'm a leader or a manager in a organization or a workplace or a team, and I'm trying to draw out the lessons from this in terms of, we look at the Shines model around, values and beliefs and things that you can actually see. And he uses the iceberg analogy, things under the water and above the water, so we can see behaviors and actions and artifacts, and we can't see values and beliefs and emotions and those sorts of things. What can we draw from those books that we can actually try to implement within our own workplaces and teams?
Yeah, I think probably stepping back from those books, I guess the where I started from was I worked with an organisation called Outward Bound. I actually did my PhD on Outward Bound, and Outward Bound's an organisation where they are developing people, they are developing teams. It's an outdoor organisation which is very much about personal development. In fact, they have the mantra of there's more to you than you think. And they also have those cultural elements that Shine talked about. So even the words outward bound means going out of the port on a voyage of self-discovery, if you like. So they have a very strong symbol of a boat going out of the harbour. They also have their logo, their badge. When you go on an outward bound course, you get a badge. So again, that very strong symbol. And I guess the values, and I guess this is where it maybe links with these high-performing teams. One of the values of Outward Bound at the time when I was involved was greatness. So, setting great expectations, and that core assumption linking to Shine's model of there's more to you think. So again, to serve, to strive, and not to yield, about pushing those boundaries.
So great expectations, that's an interesting one. So if you're an organization or a team and you wanted to bring people into the fold, into your tribe, if you like, setting great expectations, is that one of the key factors in and around organizational culture?
Certainly is for me as an educator. I set great expectations. I support people where, if you like, we're going to the Olympics, we're going for gold. We're not looking for fourth. And as an educator too, teaching, are we aiming for C's? There's an adage that C's get degrees, but the default of that is a little like fourth. It's a fail, it's a D. So trying to set those great expectations of A's and B's. And workplaces can do the same too. If we have low expectations, that's what you'll get. If you set high expectations, that's what you'll get, or that's what you're striving for anyway.
So from that, I'm thinking that values are really important as part of an organisation, and certainly something that I've been looking at is the values around some of these high-functioning, high-performing teams, and how we set expectations, behaviours, rituals, actions, if you like, the way people behave and think under these values. And we had a conversation around bringing good people into organisations and cultural fit. We use the analogy of Manchester United at the moment, who have probably struggling for the last 15, 20 years. Haven't won Premier League, I think, since 2013. Had numerous changes in leadership, but setting the values within the team to bring good people in and hiring for cultural fit rather than talent all the time. How do you see that within these books, but also with your own learnings and your own coaching?
I think, again, around the All Blacks, there's very much a strong value around that pride in winning. There's that core assumption. It's that pride in the legacy of the All Blacks. In other words, what's gone before. And Rich McCaw talks about almost that fear of letting down the jersey. He's a temporary holder of the jersey, and letting down those that have gone before him, that have set those high standards. So I think, though, we often say we shouldn't focus on winning, you should focus on the process. But when the standard is winning, that's an expectation. And again, that drives that. And part of the All Blacks, again, is that mateship, that, we're not going to let our mates down. So again, the standards are high, and we're all going to maintain those standards. And so it is setting those great expectations, setting high standards, setting out high values, so that, we're all in this together. It's a little bit like the America's Cup boat. There's one person steering the ship, but it doesn't steer straight unless everybody else is working together. And we see that currently with the America's Cup boat, Peter Burling for New Zealand, and but he can't do it on his own. We've all got to be sailing the ship. I mean, arguably a ship will sail itself with nobody on it, but it may well just go around in circles. But the captain is trying to sail the ship, but it's everybody else that's pulling together to make it all sail in the same direction.
We've had conversations in the past around community and connection, and I think one of the themes around a conference we worked together on was a sense of belonging. And you mentioned mateship, and I have read that within Craig Bellaby's book around Melbourne Storm, and you mentioned it there with the All Blacks jersey, and how important it is. And I want people to draw parallels from this into their own lives and their own workplaces and where they work and their teams, is how important that is to not necessarily like the people that you're in and around, but bringing a sense of enjoying coming to work and having a connection or being part of a team and having that social cohesion. How important is that to be around in terms of having an effective and a performing team?
I think that links particularly to the Silver Ferns. And I think one of the adages with the Silver Ferns is that they certainly have a very caring culture. I think one of the core assumptions within those Silver Ferns is that acceptance of cultural and personal diversity. The Silver Ferns have, historically had South Africans in the team, Pacific Islanders in the team, Maori, etc. So it's very much a culturally diverse, and arguably the All Blacks is the same. That culturally diverse team, but also I think within any team there is a range of diverse personalities. So again, that acceptance of that diversity within the team becomes really important. But we're still all in this together. Doesn't matter where we come from, what our backgrounds are, we're all in this together. And that was very clear with the All Blacks and the Silver Ferns that, hey, we're all in this together.
So it's about setting that vision and where we want to get to, but also the why, the purpose. To quote Simon Sinek, talks about the why factor quite a lot, like what is our purpose and why are we here? But also, where are we trying to get to, the vision, and all getting on the bus. We always hear that analogy, don't we? Is everybody on the bus? And I think we've had conversations in the past about you can sort of, I heard this with Chris, one of the previous podcasts around Liverpool, where they had Klopp had a no dickhead policy. And I've read that with the All Blacks as well around in that book Legacy. We can have talented people, but we can only really afford to carry one dickhead, because the moment you get 1.5, they still have to cause a click and a bit of a problem. So really, it goes back to that hiring for cultural fit and being the right parts within the team. You don't pick your best 11, you pick your 11 best, which is kind of a cricket or a football analogy. And something I jotted down here we've had in the notes was that better people make better All Blacks. And it keeps coming back to that cultural fit. But it reminded me of Richard Branson at Virgin, where he said, we want to train people so they can leave. That's the PD part. But also we want to set the culture so they can move on if they wanted to. What are your thoughts around that, about building that environment, better All Blacks and better people?
Well, I think that's key. Whatever workplace you're in, certainly it's not just better people, better All Blacks. It's better people make better All Blacks. And again, it comes back to the outward bound motto. There's more to you think. So it is about developing the person, as well as developing the footballer or the rugby player or the netballer. So yeah, the person comes first. And that's the important part in terms of developing teams. Everybody's different within that team, and it's how we bring that together, and that comes down to leadership as well.
So I think a part of sense of belonging has been, and something that I've been a part of with other teams, and I'm sure you have too, and I've read several examples of this, about putting rituals in place. And those day-to-day processes, whether it's in a workplace or a team, is like those little 1% plays that kind of sit behind traditions and things that we do well each day and every day. How important is it just putting rituals in place to be part of a team?
Well, I think that's one of Shine's key parts of his model, is the visual representation of culture. And with the All Blacks, that might be the silver fern, the jersey. Similarly with the silver ferns, obviously the dress, the silver fern. That's symbol. That's things that we see. But also the rituals. The All Black is very evident with the haka, for example, is a very evident ritual that occurs. That's very much part of being the All Black. Similarly for the Silver Ferns, and the presentation of the jersey is a very important ritual, and how much you value that. I think for any culture, it's understanding those things that are important for that culture, but also understanding that, what are those visual representations? It could be just as simple as, a team jersey, making sure that, we're all wearing the same thing at the workplace. In other words, it's a collective. It could be, a university top. It could be a sports team club top. I know with a football team that I coached, it was about coming dressed. So, we had a shirt and we had a tie and we had the club tie. Now, some of the players may have thought, well, why are we doing this? But it was about creating a standard that when we turned up and we were representing the club, we had a shirt on and we had a tie on, and now that then transcended to the pitch because we were going to perform in the same way because we had that sense of belonging. We were part of the club and the club had that standard. It had a standard of winning, but it also had a standard of how we look, how we dress. Again, that transfers to the workplace. Do we have an expectation of standards in dress, standards in how we deal with colleagues? They're all, again, visual representations of a culture. And if we don't have those standards, again, it comes down to that. What are the expectations? If we have low expectations of dress and that sort of thing, does that manifest itself in terms of our performance? But if we have that high standard of dress, that's a visual representation of a potential performance.
I read a book by Dan Coyle, The Culture Code. It's quite a famous book. And he talks about how culture is basically the 6 feet around you as an individual and how you're actually rubbing off on other people and what you're bringing. It's almost like that t-shirt analogy, what you want people to say when you arrive, and then on the back of the t-shirt, what do you want them to say when you left, and how you're influencing and your little part within that team. And you going back, you were talking about sense of belonging, and I've made a note here about New Zealand identity, and it seems that Silver Fern brand, whatever national team that you're in or whatever sport you're in, seems to be really important and embedded within, I guess, the heritage over in New Zealand. And maybe we do have that in England, but probably not to that certain extent. I always see England as quite fragmented and regionalised, and certainly around sport, there's that north-south divide. Football's a national game, but it's more rugby union in the south and more rugby league in the north. And I always felt like New Zealand was probably a bit more united around that identity. Do you think that you talked about the tie, and having standards of dress and all that sort of stuff, which is probably a bit more traditional back in the day type stuff? But how important is identity within regards to not just the national teams, but buying into a vision of an organisation as well?
I think it links again to coming back to Shine's model. There's the visual identity of the black dress or the black jersey, etc. So that's a visual, but it also then links to the values and beliefs. So again, if you look at the belief behind New Zealand teams, for example, so there's a belief behind the blacks that we will win. We're not going to lose. And you could argue, in New Zealand, we talk about number 8 wire, and, even though all these other countries are bigger than us, arguably they should be better than us, we'll still find a way to win. So that sets that identity in terms of that belief. And again, it comes back to that outward bound core assumption. There's more to you think. And there's, arguably the same with the New Zealand team, or that winning culture is actually we bet well above our weight. In other words, we're going to do better than you think. And that comes down to values and belief that actually we do think we're going to do well. And again, for an organisation, that's the same. It's about setting expectations around that belief that, this is a good organisation. This is a good organisation to work for. We enjoy working for this organisation. So that, again, sets an expectation, doesn't it? And that drives performance. And ultimately, in a sporting sense, that drives winning. Winning in a corporate environment, maybe bottom line, we're actually successful financially. But it's about setting expectations right from the start. And the America's Cup has to be one of the best examples in New Zealand. But, how does New Zealand keep winning the America's Cup? We don't have the same money. We don't have the same resources, but we're innovative. We're creative. We've got a vision. So it's very much that sort of transformational leadership that Peter Blake had originally around, bringing a team together, and we'll find a way. We'll just have to think of different ways, and we maybe have to think out the square. And that probably, again, lends itself to the All Blacks. In other words, if you do the same every time, you're not going to win. So it's that learning culture that we actually have to, that constant improvement, constant, looking, how can we do things a little bit differently? How do we do those 1%ers a little bit better than the others? So we do the same. If we're the winning team and we do the same, everybody is copying us. Or America's Cup, they want to do the same. We had the side clause and that sort of thing, something different. Everybody else is doing it. So what's our next? And the All Blacks will be doing that the same. Scott Robertson's come in as a new coach, does the same as everybody else. Arguably, the South Africans have done something different. They've changed the way that they do substitutions and that sort of thing. They kick the ball in the air. Well, that's doing something different. The All Blacks want to stay ahead. They're going to have to change, and they're going to have to be the leaders. So it's about that learning culture, driving the organisation ahead to not just change, but we're going to do things a little bit better or a little bit different.
I always remember a chapter in that book, Legacy, around, it was a Maori proverb about Maui and change, and even when you're at the top, to keep developing and keep innovating. And I think that probably has got some merit to what you're saying around innovation and having to change, because you have to keep winning and keep pushing the boundaries. Something else that popped into my mind was Owen Eastwood, a Kiwi working in England, around that book Belonging, but also the book Sapiens and Harari talking about how the human race use storytelling around innovation and building a story around the identity. And you hear in sport a lot of analogies of people telling stories to, especially if you're the underdog, and painting pictures of, we're the underdog here at the cup final, and, they've not given us a chance, and all that sort of stuff. And it can really work if you have a common story that you can sit around and build your whole ethos around, if you like, your whole season, or even one game. And we were talking about the Chicago Bulls before, and you've got The Last Dance, that documentary on Netflix. Phil Jackson was the coach. Michael Jordan was obviously the gun player, but they had to go through a rebuild phase after winning numerous championships in the NBA. And then it became about identity and stories. And Jordan would create these stories in his head of how opposition had wronged him, or somebody had said something, and use that as motivational fuel for his performances. And I see organizations and teams as the same as well. Like, what is our purpose and vision, and what's the story that we're all basically sitting around the campfire telling?
I think there's probably a more interesting story around the Chicago Bulls was actually before they started winning, because and actually how did they start winning? Because they were a losing team before Phil Jackson came in, and as arguably a no-name coach with the best player in the world, it was, how do you coach Michael, especially if the team's losing? But it was around Michael making the team look good. He was already scoring 30 or 40 points a game, and he was trying to do better. But it was about doing better by making his team look good. So rather than him scoring more points, it was actually about him scoring less and actually passing the ball to make his team look good. And I think that's a really good analogy in terms of the team approach. And again, the rest is history with the Chicago Bulls. And obviously they had some really good players as well as Michael to make that team look good. But again, Phil Jackson came in with the mantra of making the team look good. And I think that's, whether it's the All Blacks, whether it's the Silver Ferns, it's that collective leadership, not one player being the best player. We've all got to play well together. So it's that collective. And I think we've seen over the last 20 years that sort of collective leadership approach come in with the All Blacks. They formed a senior leadership team. And you could argue, well, actually, if the senior leaders have a voice, what about the junior leaders? Do they have a voice? So, there's an argument there is actually the All Blacks now talk about, we want more leaders in our team, not just senior leaders. We want more leaders. So it doesn't matter what position you are in, potentially and that transfers to the workplace too. So you might have a boss. Does that mean nobody else is a leader within the team? So again, that analogy of, can we develop leadership within our teams so we have more leaders within our team? And again, that strengthens the culture within the team, that we're all in this together. So I think that's an important, not necessarily change, but insight over the last 20 years, where we've gone for that more collaborative approach rather than leader-led. But also, if we've got senior leadership teams, does that mean that excludes others in the team from being a leader? And what about the juniors' ideas? So this leader-led and developing leadership within the team becomes, I think, a really important insight.
Yeah. And for me, that it kind of comes back to what I said before. I'm not sure if I got the quote quite right, where I'm Richard Branson saying, we train people so they can leave, but we build the culture that so they don't want to, and giving people a bit more ownership of the little piece of the pie, if you like, or the part within the team. And to me, that says you've got a top-down approach in terms of leadership. You've also got that ownership of the bottom up, where people within that team or organization need to take ownership of what happens, because essentially the culture is about the people and the relationships within any particular team or organization. And if you can actually take those people on the journey with you by giving them that responsibility, if they're a good cultural fit, then I think that can go a long way to building the culture. It's not always about the leader actually trying to drive it all of the time. You listen to Roy Keane on the Overlap now and talking about times gone by at Manchester United. It wasn't just about Ferguson at the top. There was several drivers or people within that dressing room making that dynasty or the organisation great. And I think if you can try and drill down into some of the world leading organizations and bottle that, you probably find that it's a similar model. I mean, would you agree with that? Or
yeah, I think it comes back again to setting those expectations, and within those great teams, you could argue that there are many leaders. If it's a sporting analogy, you've got the goalkeeper leader, you've got the defensive leaders, you've got the midfield leaders, you've got the attacking leaders. So you can't be successful just because you've got a good striker. You've got to be successful because actually everybody's leading. So I think that setting expectations that doesn't matter what role you have within the team, collectively we're trying to make the team good. And actually, if we're not, then again the values are diminished. Again, it links to your values as well, because if we're not all performing, how does that impact your values in terms of honesty and integrity and all that sort of stuff that might be your values? So I think again, it is bringing everybody up, and that's about setting expectations. So you set your expectations low, people will conform to that. If you set your expectations high of, maybe the old analogy of a shirt and a tie, then that's the bar that we have. And I think we're, good teams continue to raise the bar, and that's what the All Blacks certainly do, and the Silver Ferns are trying to do as well. So America's Cup, they'll be looking to win the America's Cup again. So you can't do the same. We've got to continue to raise their bar, and that's it's not dramatic. It may be just those 1%ers in terms, but if we all improve the 1%er, then we're 100% better. So it's those little setting those expectations high, and making sure those goals and standards are high, and then we're all working towards those.
Yeah, I often always come back to the values, and a friend of mine who kind of lit the fire around organizational culture under me several years ago in one of my previous roles always comes back to the values. And you'll find different people that work within this industry around culture and consultation will all have their views on what drives things. Some people focus on emotions, some people focus on values, but there's a whole heap of things that come together. And you talked about Shine's model, and for people listening want to go and have a look at that, there are lots of pieces to that concept of culture, if you like. Some sitting under the water you can't see, and some out of the water that you can. For anybody listening, Andy, like, you want to obviously have the values on the wall, and I'm looking at some now in the office around Massey University, which are really about the accepted norms and behaviours that we want to see, feel, and hear within any organisation day to day. And we talked about rituals before and building a sense of belonging. Oh, if you're a team, if you're a manager, a CEO, or a leader listening to this, how do you actually get employees, and we've touched on some of this before around ownership, to actually start to live up to those values and use them as a bit of a mantra and think and behave in line with those values. And we've used the All Blacks and the Silver Ferns as examples of that. But in a day-to-day office environment, how can we actually get members of our team or as a manager to actually live up to those standards or those values? I mean, what are your thoughts on that? How do you drive that?
I think, again, it comes back to Shine's model, that there are some of those things that are visual, and making sure that staff or colleagues are aware of what those important rituals are. It could be as simple as a morning tea that, we're all meeting together, or it could be a staff meeting, which is a ritual that happens every week, and it's an important ritual, and we all need to be there. So that's an example. It comes back to, again, those visual standards. If we're expected to all wear a shirt and a tie, well, we're all expected to wear a shirt and tie. And it may be we're all expected to wear a shirt and a tie that has a corporate logo on it. In other words, that we're all in this together. We're sporty analogy, we're all wearing the same shirt. And that, again, gives buy-in. It gives pride in the jersey. It gives pride in Massey University, for example. So whatever, as you said, we all are beings that like that belonging, whether it's a sport club, whether it's a sport team, whether it's a business that we're working for. We like to belong, and we like to feel welcome within that. Shine's model is a good one in terms of just understanding what are those important symbols, visual symbols, what are those important rituals. Because when you're new to an organization, you may not be aware of those. But then also around those, understanding what the values of the organization, and again, they're shared values. So I remember Wayne Smith was really big on, each year it's a new team, because we may, it changes. So just because we had shared last year doesn't mean it's the same this year. So we actually need to make sure that we're all on the same page. So we're all, so again, those discussion of values, it's not just something that's written in a document and put on the shelf. These are lived values. And I know that, Outward Bound, which I mentioned before, Outward Bound's an organisation that's been going since the Second World War, again, based in England originally. But the review of values that Outward Bound New Zealand has done was to say, well, are the values that were there set in England 50 years ago the same as what we now have in New Zealand? And so they've now reviewed their values and adapted those values, and their values are bilingual as well now, whereas previously they were English. So again, that just shows the, values need to be revisited. And we also need to be able to share. So Outward Bound used to have about 9 values. Well, could you remember all 9? They've now got it down to 3. So, it's much easier to remember what your values are. And again, I can still remember, Outward Bound's core assumption does more to you than you think, and Outward Bound's a good example. They've been voted, best place to work in New Zealand on more than one occasion. So they're living the values, but again, it's a learning culture that means that doesn't just stay the same. If we want to keep improving, we just have to keep tweaking the culture and reviewing our values and reviewing our rituals. And maybe what we did 50 years ago isn't what we do now.
Yeah.
Or maybe it is, because actually, we have a very strong product. So yeah, I think it's important to keep, not just have it on the wall. These are lived values, they're lived beliefs. And it's that comes back to that learning culture, but also I think as a self-awareness, it's that caring culture that we're dealing with people. It's not just baked bean tins.
Yeah, I found that quite interesting what you've just said there around it's not a set and forget system, if you like. It's something that you've got constantly evolving, and you've got to keep revisiting. And on my website talks about evolution and evolving your culture. And like you've also said, you've got experienced All Blacks who generally sit at the back of the bus and the youngsters sit at the front. And you've got people at different points on their journey within actually, whether it's the All Blacks or whether it's Outward Bound. And the reason you've got to keep revisiting it is because you've got new people coming into the system that need to understand, what the rituals are and the traditions and where we were trying to get to and what our purpose is. I have been part of organisations in the past where we'll do a cultural session at the start of a season, and sometimes it's been forgotten about and parked and put on a shelf. But the good organisations revisit it within 3 to 6 months and like, where are we at now? And what went well and what didn't go so well? What do we need to tweak? We might have a new employee coming in, right? They obviously have to be part of an induction process and come in and understand what we're about. And I think probably from more of an employment point of view, that's where your good hires come in, and being really thorough about the people you're bringing into the system for cultural fit rather than not just ability.
Very much so. I think that, again, one of the things that the All Blacks have done, Steve Hanson's been part of this as well, was sharing your background. So you're an All Black now, but you weren't always an All Black. So you've played club rugby and you've maybe played regional rugby and that sort of thing. So sharing, and I know they use, bringing in the club tie. So, actually we're all an All Black, so we're all wearing the same tie now, or we're all wearing the same jersey. But actually we've come from the Manawatu, or we've come from Wellington, or we've come from a club. So bringing your tie in from that club, or your socks or whatever, and sharing that. And actually, so that's where we've come from. So actually, we're not just an All Black. There's a legacy behind that. And there's a lot of history behind those sporting clubs and those, Ramfurly Shield and all that sort of stuff in New Zealand. So it's that legacy that it's not just now, but we actually bring our legacy with us as well. And I'd argue it's about leaving a legacy, but it's also about leading a legacy. The current All Blacks are leading a legacy. Yes, they're leaving a legacy, but they're also leading a legacy. And I think that's key. And again, coming back to Outward Bound, that's an organisation that's been going since 1941. So in New Zealand, started in 1962, over 60 years now. So there's a legacy of these organisations. And it's really important not to forget that legacy is there, and sharing that legacy, because that's part of the success. That these are organisations that are still around, and as with the All Blacks, they're still successful 100 years later. So why? And part of that is the legacy that's come. So, that's a core assumption, pride in that legacy. So sharing that.
They talk about leaving the shirt in a back place, and you're the custodian of that shirt or that jersey for a period of time. It's not yours. And we spoke earlier that there are a number of All Blacks who only play one game, one test match for the All Blacks.
Right.
And then you've got Richie McCaw, who's played over 100 test matches, but they've all tried to leave that shirt. And it's a really good analogy and a way of looking at it. In a better place, you're just the custodian, not the owner. And it's something that would be really good in terms of the workplace and other teams and organisations to bring that mode of thinking into the workplace. And just trying to turn the dial 1%. I mean, before you talked about, like, if everybody just basically ratchets up 1% collectively as a team, that means we're really cooking on gas, we're flying.
100%.
Something that I wanted to tease out from what you mentioned before was around inclusivity and diversity. And I always struggle with those two concepts because I always see them as sometimes different ends of the spectrum or poles apart. Like, we want to be really inclusive within our teams, but we also want to embrace diversity because we've all got different backgrounds and heritage and where we were born and all the rest of it. And I always find that the good teams actually have time to recognise the diversity within the team as a strength and then come together inclusively as a whole. Chatting to James Roby at St Helens Rugby League Club last month when I was in the UK, and he talked about one of the great teams he was in, the Super League, and people might follow the Super League out there in the NRL, but St Helens, a town famous for glass in the northwest of England, and had a real dynasty of winning Super League and Challenge Cups. And James won something like 6 Super Leagues and 4 Challenge Cups. But in the great teams he was part of, there was time, I remember a guy, Daniel Anderson, that coached the Warriors, coached St Helens in sort of the mid-2000s, 2006, and they were a great team. And some of the stuff that they built was people being vulnerable and actually sharing about who they were. What I find when I do some of these workshops is people don't understand who their colleagues and peers are and what makes them tick and what turns them on and turns them off. They just go to work and they don't really understand or pick their head up and understand who's around them. But also on the flip side, people understanding you. And what you'll find with the good teams is to use a sports analogy as well, like you can put your arm around certain players and other players need a bit of a rocket. But within the workplace, we don't really understand or take time to understand what makes us work and what makes us tick as human beings. And I find the good teams and the good organizations actually, well, they drill down into that and they revisit it regularly. You think that's something that the workplace or teams could actually try to understand better?
I think it's key, and I want to give the example of the All Blacks, sharing their club backgrounds and all that sort of stuff. And the Silver Ferns, as I said, very strong, caring culture, and there's that diversity within, natural diversity. And I think as we go to more global teams, and that's global teams within the workplace and global teams within the sport team, it becomes even more important to understand, where people are coming from. And I know that, the Silver Ferns have done that really well, and they're in a situation where some of their team are mothers. So in the past, it was like, well, what are we going to do with the baby, if you like? But now it's, there's an accepted very much part of the team culture that you're not just coming as a Silver Fern. There's part of you that's a mother or, a daughter, etc. It's part of a bigger picture. So again, sharing that, and again, sharing the cultural, we live in a very multicultural society here in New Zealand, and sharing that cultural background. And I think, that's very evident within the Silver Ferns. Ian van Dijk from South Africa and others from Pacific Islands. If you don't understand their background, it's very hard to be part of a successful team, even though it's a Kiwi team. And that, again, we talked about diversity in the workplace. We should, one of the key assumptions or core assumptions for the Silver Ferns is that acceptance of cultural and, personal diversity, that, we can all be different, but we're actually all in the same team. And so whilst we accept that diversity, we can actually all go in the same direction, but we need to accept that diversity first.
I think from a sporting analogy, we don't always look at these people as employees. And it's very much like, oh, you paid a lot of money in some instances, some people aren't still. And you look at it and you go, well, you're a professional sports person, so get on with it. And there's certain things that are accepted in those environments that, and I'm thinking recently, I'm not sure if you saw this, but the Liverpool game against Bournemouth on the weekend, a fan in a wheelchair was ejected because he was racially abusive to one of the Bournemouth players. And irrespective of that player earning X number of pounds to kick a ball around, essentially, he's an employee of an organisation, and that shouldn't really be accepted. It's what's accepted in the workplace versus sport, and those things are starting to come closer together now. And you talked about the Silver Ferns, great example, bringing baby to work, but obviously now it's about who you are. And I always struggled at first, like with the workplace, and you might be the same, Andy. Please stop me if I'm wrong, but you come into the workplace and some people would bring all their baggage with them, and they would have those conversations about what they did on the weekend and what went well and what didn't well, and who's seeing who and all the rest of it. Versus you cross the threshold into work and you're there to do a job, and it's that balancing act of the person versus the employee. And again, I think the good organisations probably strike a balance where I've been in organisations where I see he's pulled me to one side and said, a member of your team's having a 20-minute conversation at the start of the workday every day rather than doing some work. So it's like, how do I deal with that issue in the right way? And obviously have that member of my team actually doing the job, but also feeling part of the organisation, and that they can have like a 5-10 minute conversation to build relationships with that person within the team. So again, if you transfer that to the workplace or sporting analogy or high performance environment, it's sort of how do you make that person feel part of the team, but also want to do the role, and obviously recognizing diversity and they are employees in the workplace too.
I think, again, coming back to the Silver Ferns is a good example. Well, a value for them is that you're a Silver Fern on and off the court. You can't just walk out the door and you're not an employee, if you like. You're still an employee, even though you might not be at work. So, whether you're a father, whether you're a sports person, whether you're a worker, you can't just flip the hat on and off. You're a father 24/7. You're a Silver Fern 24/7. And I think if we think at the Silver Ferns, they're fantastic role models. We very rarely, if ever, hear of a negative story in the that hits the media. Whereas there are other sports where maybe we do hear some negative stories. So clearly they're not necessarily living the values of their sport off the field. So it's about how we perform what we're expecting on the field, but also what we're expecting off the field. And again, it comes back to, the values and the expectations that we set right from the start. And whether you're a mother or a father are setting expectations for your kids, or whether you're a coach or a captain setting expectations for your team, or whether you're a leader within the workplace setting expectations for your team, it's about those expectations. If you don't set the expectations, then that's where we do get the negative stories. So I think, again, it comes back to, those values that we set, whether that's at home, whether that's in the workplace, whether that's in a sporting sense. These, if we expect to lose, then we probably will. If our expectations are we win, we probably will. But it's about setting those standards and, maintaining those and going forward. So I think, again, it comes back to expectations, values, and comes back to Shane's model, which is, his model originally was set for the workplace, and the examples we've used of Outward Bound and the All Blacks and Silver Ferns are moving that model into different contexts, but, arguably shows that it does work in a different context. But yeah, those symbols, those visual representations of culture are important, but the values are important, and those core assumptions are important.
The chat I had with James Roby in the UK, he talked about a line of courage within the organisation that they've used previously as part of teams, high performance teams. I think where people can struggle, especially in the workplace, is holding your teammate or your peer accountable. And it becomes a bit of a skill and an art form of how you actually address that. And they talked about the line of courage within the organisation, and it was a collective thing within that team that they could actually say, the way we behaved today, or what we did here, was that above or below the line? And you hear that quite a lot in a cultural sense, is going below the line's, fairly negative, and we're hardwired to go below the line because it's a defense mechanism in the human brain, the human being. But we want to try and live mostly above the line. And they would address that by, in team meetings or even day-to-day interactions, and say, was that above the line or below the line, and where do we want to be as a team? And I think it comes back to what you were just saying there about expectations and standards and values. And that's the way they dealt with it within their team. I'm sure other teams would have a way of dealing with that. Maybe team meetings at work is a similar thing where you would address that.
Yeah, and I think one of the things to understand too is that leaders are a catalyst for change. You can't force it. As a parent, you're a catalyst, hopefully, for your kids' good behaviour. That might be role modelling good. That might be role modelling good behaviour. And similarly, in teams, the leaders are, we can go and say, right, we're going to win today, but that doesn't necessarily we're going to win. We need everybody to be on the same page going forward. So that lends itself to about developing more leaders within the team. So if we're all being a leader going forward, then we've actually got the whole team on the same page going forward. If we've got one that's kind of like, I don't want to change here, then maybe we're pulling it back. But it's about how do we get everybody on the same page? And I think that's where leaders are certainly a catalyst for change. And going through the process we've talked about today, I think certainly helped that process.
Yeah. I heard a former family member was part of the Special Forces in the UK, and pardon my French, but they had an analogy within Special Forces: lead, be led, or get the fuck out of the way. And that to me says, look, as a team, you can be a leader and take some responsibility, or you can follow the person that's willing to lead and actually be part of the team. It starts to become a problem when you're not one of those two camps and you're dipping in and out and you're being stubborn and sitting in the middle. So if you want to be a leader, then by all means pick up the gauntlet and go with it. But if you're a follower or you're part of the team, then you've got to follow the person in charge and dip in and out, taking that ownership as well, and being a leader and being a follower. And I thought that was a really good way of looking at the organisation, because sometimes it does become a problem when people either don't want to follow the plan and become a bit of an issue, or if they don't want to lead within their own little space. And I do think sometimes people look for a bit more responsibility, and it's great if they take that on, because it comes back to that 1% lifting the team again, and actually taking it forward.
Yeah, I think leadership doesn't, leadership, maybe you're a captain or a coach, so it's a formal leadership role or a manager. But you can also, there's an informal leadership, which may well just be role modeling leadership or role modeling good practice, or, being a coach within the team. So just coaching others. And again, that peer-to-peer learning. So if you're an All Black, and you're a new All Black coming in, it's about educating the new All Black in terms of, what are the standards, what are the core assumptions, what are the values of this team. And as we've heard, not everybody stays as an All Black. Yeah, it's about making sure that there's an understanding of what are our core assumptions going forward.
Andy, we've got a couple of stock standard questions that we ask every guest on Culture 360 podcast. What's the one thing we're missing? So the one thing in organisational culture where you've gone, aha, or a light bulb moment, or a bit of a maverick idea, is there something out there that you've read or that you've heard or that you've seen, you thought, that's a bit of a left field idea, but I like it, or something that we're not doing? What's the one thing that we're missing?
I think for me, comes back to that expectations. If you set expectations, there's more chance you're likely to be successful. And so setting those expectations, whether that's at home with your kids, whether that's at school, whether that's aiming for A's and B's, whether that's in the sporting context, we don't normally set an expectation that we're going to lose. Yeah, setting whatever walk of life we're in, the glass is half full.
Okay. One final question, Andy. Finish this sentence. Culture is. What does it mean to you?
I think it has to come down to people. That's what it's all about.
And I think on that note, Andy, thank you for your time and your knowledge and welcoming us to Massey University. It's been a pleasure and always really good to see you. So thank you for your time and being part of the podcast today. Thank you, Andy. If you enjoyed the Culture 360 podcast, and like me, you geek out on leadership and organisational culture, then please smash a like, subscribe, and share the podcast. Also, if you have any feedback or ideas, or you'd like to get in touch, then please connect with the Culture Room at thecultureroom.co.nz or on our various social media platforms. Thanks for listening.